Hey everyone, welcome to Your Money Map, sponsored by the Alliance for Lifetime Income. I'm your host, Jean Chatsky. Very glad to have you with us today. Today, we are diving into a topic that in years of this show, we haven't touched on. It's one that is personal, very personal for many of us. We're talking about leaving a legacy, and maybe you have thought about how you want to support your children or your grandchildren, or you're wondering how to make a meaningful impact on your favorite causes, or maybe you're just trying to find the right balance between generosity and your own financial security. If any of that sounds even a little familiar, well, you're not alone. Nearly 80% of pre retirees and retirees say they want to prioritize charitable giving in retirement. But with rising longevity and concerns about outliving savings, how do you figure out how much you can truly afford to give without putting your own future at risk? To help us unpack that question and many others, we are joined today by Dr. Russell James, a nationally recognized expert on charitable giving and legacy planning. Dr. James is a professor in the Department of Personal Financial Planning at Texas Tech University, where he leads the graduate program in charitable financial planning. Before this, he served as director of planned giving and later president of Central Christian College in Missouri. He has written more than 150 publications on estate planning, property, and philanthropic giving, with a focus on what the data actually tells us about how and why people give. Russell, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. I'm very excited to dive into this conversation. But before we do that, let's just talk a little bit about you.
Oh,
Your career has been varied, but one of the common themes has been charitable giving. How did you come to this as your field of expertise?
yeah, it's always been of interest to me. And the reality is, I started out as an attorney with an estate planning practice, but also managing planned giving for a small residential college, as you mentioned. And so vocationally kind of got into it that way and have just stuck with that space over many decades now.
Through those decades, how have you seen the landscape of charitable giving changing, particularly for retirees and those people within, say, a decade of retirement?
Well, we've certainly had changes in the tax planning approaches. The biggest happening when the standard deduction got so much higher, fewer people using charitable deductions. And so from that, we've learned that, hey, if you're not itemizing, oftentimes there are still ways to get tax advantages, whether that is making direct transfers from an IRA once you reach age 70 and a half, or perhaps making gifts of appreciated assets like stocks or other appreciated assets, because even if that doesn't generate a charitable deduction that's useful for itemizing, it does actually avoid capital gains taxes. And so, for example, one of the first things we recommend to people is instead of giving cash, if you have appreciated securities, give those old securities to the charity and use the cash to buy brand new identical shares of stock in the same companies. Now, it doesn't change your portfolio at all, but what it has done is it has wiped out that capital gain from the portfolio through the giving. So I think some of those things have changed. And I think over the years, we've had two big demographic shifts. One of those is a gradually over the decades, a reduction in frequency of attendance at religious services, and that's reflected in a reduction in religious charitable giving. And we've also seen something that really comes into play when it comes to legacy planning, and that is the new generation of those that are at or approaching retirement age. They are dramatically more likely to be childless as compared to previous generations. So, those are some of the big factors that have changed over the years.
That's an awful lot to dig into. Let's start here. As people come to the topic of legacy, as people start thinking about their legacy, whether it's a charitable one or whether it's leaving something to the people that they love, do they come at it from a perspective of save me the most on taxes that you possibly can, or do they come at it from the perspective of wanting to accomplish a particular emotional goal?
Well, certainly it would be great if people are approaching it with either a tax planning goal or a accomplishing something important for family or values. Because if we have people that come to it with a goal, then there are lots of instruments we can use to accomplish that goal. Here's the real challenge, though. Oftentimes, people don't do either of those things. They simply avoid the topic. That's actually what we see in research. Anything that reminds people of their own mortality, most common reaction you get is to just avoid it, to put it off. I'll deal with that later. That doesn't really apply to me. The problem is that those kind of reactions then lead to essentially people not engaging in any planning. So they're not thinking about their goals, whether those be tax savings or accomplishing things that have an emotional impact for them. They're just putting it off. And that's what we see even among people age 65 and above. Most simply have no planning documents. They don't have will documents. They don't have trust documents. So that's really the biggest barrier, is to actually get people to engage in the planning and to think about what would they like to accomplish with their wealth, and in particular in the estate planning context, with whatever amount of wealth happens to be left over that they haven't used during life.
I've read enough about this to be dangerous, and so I know that the reason people don't approach this, the reason that people choose not to deal with it, falls into a field of study called terror management theory,
You
which
are correct.
explain that, and what is it that we find so frightening that we can't even get ourselves to deal? Then we'll talk about how to get over it.
Yeah, so what we see from literally hundreds of experimental results is that when people are reminded of their own mortality, or they face a mortality reminder, there are two types of responses, two stages of response. The most common, the first stage response, is avoidance. And that can be expressed in a lot of ways. The idea of, well, I'm going to delay dealing with that, or that doesn't really apply to me, it applies to other people, or simply staying away from that particular reminder. There is, however, a second stage response when people move beyond that avoidance response. And that's actually in the research called the pursuit of symbolic immortality. Now, what does that
What does
word
that
mean?
mean?
So what that means is really just the idea of recognizing, okay, I get it. I'm going to disappear. I'm not going to be here forever, but I'd like to make an impact that continues on beyond me. And so that sense of continuing my impact, what's called symbolic immortality, can be a real attraction and a motivation to why we engage in the planning. That we know that, we're going to not be here, but through planning, we can make an impact that can continue on for an extended period of time, whether that be through charitable causes or the impact that we might have on our family and heirs. That's where we really get the motivation to try to engage in that planning. If we can get past that kind of avoidance response, that icky feeling of, oh, I don't want to sign that will, that means I'm going to die, or, whatever these underlying fears are.
As you said, the statistics on the number of people who've done this kind of planning, who have wills, is it just makes me sad every time I look at it. How do you get people to engage?
Yeah, there are a number of different motivations depending upon the person. Now, you already mentioned one of them, which is the tax avoidance, right? So the idea of, hey, if you don't plan, then the government's going to take a big chunk of what you've got. Well, there's a lot of people that are highly motivated by that reality, and so they'll go ahead and get past the desire not to plan for these things. And that, by the way, that starts regardless of what size of an estate that you have. Most people think, oh my goodness, I don't have that 50 million, 30 million, whatever the estate tax laws now exempt. But here's the problem. If you've got even $1,000 in a retirement account, well, did you know that any of that money, that IRA, 401k money that's inherited by heirs, they've got to pay income taxes on it. But any of that that we leave to a charitable cause completely avoids those income taxes. So, so taxes can be an issue even for very small estates and can be a motivation to plan. There's other motivations of really just wanting to have that peace of mind that comes when you know it's all done. I don't have to think about it anymore. It is in place the way that I want it to be. And so sometimes those kinds of motivations can be helpful. That even if it's unpleasant, boy, it's going to feel better when it's all done and it's all in place. Sometimes that can motivate people to make it happen.
I think I'm probably not alone in that I did my first will with my ex-husband right before we took our first trip without our young child. Right before we got on a plane for the first time with this person in the world, we were like, we must have a will. And I've had one ever since. When you look at the intentions behind the planning, what do you see as far as motivations and trends in terms of charitable giving and the leaving of inheritance from the generation that is this peak 65 generation?
Yeah. So as far as trends, and by the way, that motivation of going on a trip and so doing the estate planning, it's actually not all that uncommon. We actually see that people will engage in estate planning for at very specific times: birth of a first child, birth of a first grandchild, change in family structure of any sort. So marriage, divorce, the widowhood, those will all trigger planning. And Also, if somebody gets a negative diagnosis, so then that's okay. I've got to face this. I've got to deal with this. And so your trip that you went on is a bit like a negative diagnosis. That it's
Right.
like, oh, something could happen. Let's plan. As far as trends over time, families are families, and charitable causes are charitable causes. But we do see some differences in, number one, family structure. A lot more blended families, a lot more complex goals, also a much higher likelihood of childlessness. The charitable goals can also be different depending upon what a person's desired cause is, and some of those cause types have shifted over time. But when we look at motivation, that motivation oftentimes will link back to those two responses that I mentioned to you, to mortality salience. So a lot of people, if they're trying to do something charitable, they'll include what I call the small pat on the head gifts, just for charities that have been part of their life. They're supposed to put something in, so they'll put something small in. But for those really major life investment gifts, people are looking to do something that is meaningful, that is visualizable, and that has a sense of permanence. So that might be something like a scholarship fund or a permanent endowment for a particular project or goal or cause, something that's going to make a lasting but also a visualizable impact. Those are the kinds of things that tend to motivate these major life investment gifts in estate planning. And we see that today. Honestly, though, we've seen that for many years. There was one study of wills in the 1800s that found that the large gifts were the ones that would come with more instructions. What specifically were they going to be used for? What specifically were they going to accomplish? And what we see from experimental research is that will actually increase the size of the gift if it is accomplishing something specific, visualizable, and meaningful. And when it comes to the estate giving context, we're trying to accomplish something that has a lasting impact. Now, I mentioned how that has an effect with the charitable planning. It also should have an effect with our planning for family members. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the tendency is if we do any planning at all, then it's just divided up equally. Everybody gets it in one big lump sum right at death. Well, we've looked at national data on what actually happens to those inheritances. And what we've seen now from multiple national studies is that when the inheritance was received is measured on average about a year later, 41% of the time, it's completely gone. That person's net worth has actually fallen below where it was before they got the inheritance. So there is a tendency to spend these inheritances very rapidly. Now, why is that? Well, it's the same notion that we were talking about before. You remember that avoidance response? This money, this inheritance money, emotionally is not like any other kind of money. Think of it this way. If I were to say to you, hey, your mom died, so here's your sack of mom death money. Oh, by the way, you've still got some mom death money. What do you want to do with your dead mom's money, right? Now I'm being sort of obnoxious with it there, but that gives you the flavor of the underlying psychological experience of getting this death money. So, what is the most common response? Avoidance. And what do people typically tend to do? They get rid of it. They spend it. They spend it very rapidly. Now, this is something that people don't realize when they are planning their estates because they might say, "Oh, my family, they're not spendthrifts. This isn't going to be a problem." But they don't realize how this is so different when you leave them all the money as one lump sum right at the end of life, right when you just had the funeral and here's your lump sum of money. It tends to be dissipated very quickly.
So I see two potential solutions to this, and maybe we could talk through both of them. One is to set up a system of trusts or strings attached that would uh, dole out the money in chunks rather than all at once so that the recipient doesn't have the beneficiary doesn't have the opportunity to blow it. But the other, and I think about this a lot in my own life, is giving during life rather than just giving at death. So I'm 60 years old. My oldest child is 30, about to be 31. Hopefully, I live another 30 years, which makes him 60. I hope he doesn't need my money when he's 60, but boy, he could sure use some of it now. Um, how do we how do we think about those things, particularly when research from the Alliance consistently shows that people have a fear of running out of money?
Yeah, so this is something where I think we begin with the goals of what are you trying to accomplish? Oftentimes people won't think about goals. I mean, the goal is, well, let's get it planned, let's save taxes, rather than what you're talking about, which is what kind of an impact do I want to make on this person's life? So oftentimes what we'll talk about is think about your goals that you want to leave behind in family, for family, not in terms of what's the right lump sum, but rather in terms of what's the right amount of permanent income or lasting income you would like to leave. You see, if you think of your goal in terms of, well, how much of my wealth do I want to leave? Well, it's always just all of it, right? There's
Right.
no end point there. But if we begin to think of our goal in terms of impact on the heirs, in terms of ongoing income, that's a goal that we may be able to reach. And in fact, we may be able to reach that with our current level of wealth and still have more left over. And it is that realization that I can accomplish everything I want to accomplish for my heirs and still have some left over that frees us to look at some charitable impact, some impact on causes that have been important in our lives. This is the same thing when it comes to not just legacy giving, but also giving in our own lives. Most people will only think of their giving as something that kind of comes from disposable income, right? It's just whatever happens to be left over. Here's a few dollars for this, a few dollars for that. The problem is people will never feel comfortable sharing from their wealth unless they've engaged in the kind of lifetime planning that lets them become comfortable with saying, "Hey, I've got enough," right? And unless we have a lifetime income component, it's really hard to say, "Oh, I've got enough." But one of the clear goals of planning, not just financially, but emotionally, is helping people get to the place where they can feel like, "I've got enough." Because once they get to that place, then that means part of their wealth becomes extra. And when part of your wealth becomes extra, it makes it so much more fun to use in sharing and having an impact with the family right now, in having a charitable impact, and maybe doing something for yourself consumption wise. That's fine as well. So that's really the goal. And so whether we're looking at that goal for our heirs, what kind of a long-term impact do we want to have, or we're looking at that goal for ourselves, do I have enough? Both of those goals are very powerful, because once we describe a goal that has a reachable level, that means once we hit that, everything else is just bonus. It's gravy, it's extra. And we can have a lot more fun with that, rather than always being anxious that, oh, I might need it someday, so maybe I shouldn't spend anything.
We talk an awful lot about annuities on this show, and what I'm hearing you say is that an instrument like an annuity could be used to provide yourself with a lifetime income so that you know that you'll have enough every year so that the remainder of those investments can be invested for growth, can be given away, can be that you have greater choices. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, so that is absolutely true. Absolutely the case. Once I've got, this was a world that, hey, 50 years ago, very commonly people would have extra because they had pensions, right? Everybody had pensions. And so this was just something you automatically had. But here's some other ways to think about the power of that, because oftentimes people will say, oh, I don't want to have lifetime income or buy an annuity because I have goals for my heirs, right? I want to leave some for the heirs. But what they don't realize is, if you're not protecting your asset against sort of excessive longevity, you might burn through everything and have nothing to leave for the heirs. So, in many ways, these things can work together, because if I've got this protection from what we would say is living too long, then that means I know that I'm going to have an amount that will be left over, whether that's for my heirs or to accomplish charitable goals, or whatever those goals might be. So oftentimes people think of these things as an either or, and it's not. They can actually work together, where that lifetime income planning can guarantee that there will be something left over, or guarantee that this amount, oh, that actually is available, and I can put it to work right now, because I've got extra. So it can be very powerful. And the thing that I want to suggest is that it's perhaps even more powerful when we think about what we want to leave behind for our heirs, because we see it in the national data. If you just leave a lump sum, a sack of money right at death, emotionally, that's going to lead to, in many cases, very rapid dissipation. However, if instead we leave ongoing or lifetime income, we can do that in a spendthrift trust. We could do that with an annuity product where, hey, even if they have to go bankrupt, this can be protected for them, right? Those are things that make far greater impact than just leaving it all in one lump sum at the end of life.
We know from our research that 78% of pre-retirees and retirees say that they plan to prioritize charitable giving during retirement. I also know from digging into the spending data that Chase has put together that our spending on everything goes down with the exception of two categories in retirement: healthcare and charitable giving. Those tend to go up. This is where we are putting our resources. Can you give some suggestions for two things? First of all, how do you best give? Are there methods by which giving tends to be the most effective, make the most sense? And also, is there a formula or any math hacks that you use to figure out how much you can afford to give?
Yeah, so on the first question of ways of giving that are most effective, I will say that the most effective way to give is actually to give bigger and less frequently. So, what do I mean by that? There's a tendency to just make small kind of knee-jerk reaction gifts. Okay, that's actually your least efficient way of giving. It has the highest cost for charities, raising those 50 and $100 gifts. It tends to have the lowest impact. Whereas if you were to, let's say, use a donor advised fund where you just stick it in there, regularly putting in amounts, or perhaps you have a sale of an asset and you send it to the donor advised fund and do it that way. As that accumulates, then you'll begin to have this larger amount. Say, oh, we're not just talking about 50 or $100 now. Oh, I've got a significant amount in here. This could really do something. And what that will do is it will cause you to think about it more, to plan for it more. What kind of a, because once we're talking bigger numbers, we can start thinking about a real impact that could make. So, in terms of charitable impact, that's where we have the much stronger effect, which is, save it up over time in a donor advised fund or otherwise, so that when you're ready to make that gift, it's going to be a big one. It's going to be something that you're actually going to follow up on to make sure that it does what it's supposed to do, and make an impact that is personally meaningful to you. So that would be the first recommendation that I would have. The second, you asked about how do we know how much there is to give? Well, when it comes to retirement, the biggest problem financially in retirement is this. The theory says, well, when you're working, you save it up and then you hit 65 and then you start spending it down. Here's the empirical reality. Savers save and spenders spend. What that means is you've got a chunk of people who they get to 65 and they really haven't saved anything up, right? But then you have another group of people, they get to 65 and they have saved up a lot. And then if you say to that person, the way that you have behaved for the first 65 years of your life being a saver, now do the opposite. And you know what happens? They don't. They don't, at most, they would spend some of the income, but they don't spend down any of that principal. Even though on a spreadsheet, we can say that's exactly what you should be doing. So, how can we get beyond that? Well, one of the challenges here as well is you say, well, why don't people spend it down? Again, it comes back to that same psychological reaction. Because once you start spending more than the income, you've got to calculate, how soon am I going to die? Right?
Yeah.
Because you've got to say, okay, now it's going down, but it's going to last for so long, whatever. And what do we know about making people face their mortality? They avoid it, right? So, what's the most I can spend without having to do that death calculation? The income. What do savers actually spend in retirement? Usually it maxes out at the income. Well, that's not really the best way to do it. How can we work around that? Well, one way we can work around that is to define what are my needs and then put in place that guaranteed income that's going to cover those needs so that then I can truly say all of this is extra. Once I've got extra, meaning that I'm covered, my needs are here. We've got the healthcare from Medicare. We've got the regular ongoing income and other, that's covered. That sense of having extra, which honestly, without guaranteed income, kind of hard to ever get there. That sense of having extra is what frees people up to not just give more or share more with family, but to enjoy doing it. Because if you haven't engaged in that planning and you know you've got a big number that's in some account, but you don't know, is that going to be enough? Is it not going to be enough? You never really have extra. And if you don't have that sense of having extra, then it's not going to be enjoyable to share or to give or to make that impact. It's always going to be a concern of, oh, is this something that I might need someday? So I think it can really help with that option. The other thing that helps is, boy, if you've got if you move some of those assets into a guaranteed income, you got a check that comes in the mail every day. And we're used to spending paychecks, right? That's
Right.
comfortable. And so that is one of the behavioral interventions that I have used with clients that are just, I just don't feel comfortable in spending. Well, let's take a chunk and move it into this so that you're getting this paycheck, right? This guaranteed income. And you'll see that people get a lot more comfortable in actually using their retirement assets, which is oftentimes the biggest problem among those who are savers, that they don't tend to use those assets once they actually get to those retirement ages.
Inherent in all of this is a little bit of math. And I would imagine that this is one of those conversations that if you're feeling a little perplexed about how to do it yourself, having a financial advisor in the loop would be really helpful.
Exactly, because if you these are the kind of questions that, look, as a CFP, love it if somebody comes in and says, "Hey, here's my goal. I want to have all this covered for the rest of my life so that I know how much is extra that I can do all these fun things with," right? That's exactly what the financial planners can get involved with and say, "All right, let's make that happen. Here's the way to structure this out."
Russell, if you were giving three pieces of advice to someone who is listening to this and saying, yeah, nodding along, got to do this, how do they get started?
So I think you've got to have some motivation to make the planning happen now, right? Whether that's estate planning, retirement spending, planning for guaranteed income, whether it's for you or for your heirs. So what I would say is use whatever trick helps you to make this a priority. Maybe in estate planning, it's just going to be the motivation of saying, I want to have that feeling of being able to say it's all exactly in place, planned exactly the way that I want to have it. And just that immediate enjoyment that comes from having that in place. Maybe the motivation is you right now are in a situation where if you wrote a big check, you would feel really uncomfortable that you like, I don't know, am I going to need this? Am I not going to need this? Think about getting to a place where well, this amount is going to be for my regular living expenses, and this amount, well, this is all free to use. This is all extra. This is all things that I am ready to use in different ways. And so that sense of freedom, where we can actually engage in spending or charity or sharing with family members, that kind of freedom where we can do that without the pain of, oh, I might need this. That's a much more enjoyable way to live. But we can't get there until we've gotten through that planning process to know what is extra and how we can use that extra. So use those things to motivate getting through that planning process.
Dr. Russell James, thank you for a fascinating conversation. If people who are watching are interested in finding out more about you, more about your research, where should they go?
So my website is encouragegenerosity.com. So if you go to encouragegenerosity.com, you actually, at all of the books that I've written, I put free PDFs of those there. If you want to go on Amazon, you can buy them there as well. But the free PDF versions are there, slide sets, and even some of the academic research, which I know nobody wants to slog through necessarily, but the law review articles, everything else is linked there as well. So
Nobody but me.
encouragegenerosity.com. Oh, yes, that's true. That's true. I appreciate you doing that.
If you're also looking for more information to help you navigate retirement, be sure to visit our website, the Alliance for Lifetime Income. You will find it at protectedincome.org. While you're there, take a sec, sign up for our newsletter. It's at protectedincome.org/subscribe. Russell, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you next time.